So we have time and we have about 45 minutes to discuss a little. Of course, now the word of monitoring is huge, and we will have to look at the Alpine Arc to try and think about the monitoring at the level of the Alpine Arc.
Also ask questions if there are some questions, because thank you very much, Sergio. It was really a great presentation about monitoring, and as I noticed, I think there are a lot of insights also for that was Senki just said, to have a broader view about Alpine scale. But Chiara, you wanted to ask something. I think you have to come here.
Thank you. Guys, the presentation was very interesting. I work in EURAC, research of Bolzano, and we are talking about the similar topics of implementing a database for the collection of all monitoring data we are having on different groups. Try and sending this data in a database that is immediately managed by the Museum of Natural Science. So that's a process that I've been following for 3 years, 5 years, and I've seen many problems and challenges. I had some notes and some questions. The first question asked for metadata. I think, as you showed us before, there is a Darwin core where probably we should all be aligned on as for the metadata of the data itself and on the monitoring schemes. And community data are still data that can tell us a lot, because what we've done so far is basically distribution data. But I also think that about that is not that difficult to work, because there are many experiences we can use. My question was, as for data, how did you integrate data for the part of the bird life, and how did you get it? And my second question on citizen science is if you were able to understand the difference between quality data, so from citizen science experts, and pure citizen science. And my last question is that I completely agree on absence. I think that's a point on which something zoologists need to understand, because in the last years, we worked too much on some species, and I think that there is no absence data. So that's an important thing we should work on to integrate them. So I'll start with the final question. Well, for sure, the absence figure, I think it's very important, and our database allows us to have it. It's something we always wanted, because otherwise then you have problems on database that is already operative. But I think it's something that we should all consider. On Darwin Code, unfortunately, we started when we didn't know much about the possibility of store in that way. We didn't know about the standardization of storage, but you have to understand that database is a huge Excel sheet, basically. It has all the queries, but when you download it, it's just a huge CSV file. It's basically a sheet, an Excel sheet. So in the future, we may think of harmonizing it, even in light of the exchange of database between regions and between regions. So I think that's great suggestion, because sometimes we have problems and solutions right in front of us. We did not incorporate those data except for data that were made available on different databases, because there is an overlapping sometimes between different databases. For example, our expert sending us data that were collected in Life Just 2020. If they took a photo, they can put it online, but on how to manage the quality of the citizen science data, well, at the moment, as for the input of data on the website of the observatory or through the app of the observatory, we can have quite a good quality check, since people that describe are controlled and checked. So they ask for them to be naturalist experts, or that they're part of JEV groups, and we know already formed. While from the app, a photo is mandatory, so we do a check, and if the photo is not certain, we just do not accept the figure. As for a naturalist, we filter basically through validation, expert validation, because we've seen that what the community cares a lot about validation. So they have a naturalist as a social soul. So they just find and look for people that got it wrong. So we think that is a figure, when it's validated, is a figure that can be considered as certain, I think.
Se avete fatto difficoltà a trovare dei supporto degli esperti tecnici che hanno aiutato, diciamo, nella creazione del dato per questi osservatori. Informateci.
È stato un percorso
Sì. Allora,
So the question is if we found technical experts easily to implement database. Well, it was not difficult to find experts, but it was difficult to implement the database and solve all the bugs that happen, because you start and say, well, that's data, but you arrive a lot of specific cases and that you need to understand how to manage. I can create problems, but that's an ongoing work.
Come poter calcolare in automatico.
ok,
Stiamo lavorando. Magari
sì.
So she said that on community data, people are working on it. And I think that that's one of the goals of our next future, maybe a cross-national future, which is not only to make data dialogue between them, but try and agree that we're working on a situation where at an alpine level, the change are increasing, maybe starting with experiences that are happening, we can all have a common journey, a common path. I think that's an important suggestion, since these are type of monitoring and data acquisition, which are quite different and newer than the previous ones.
Una specifica, sono Valentina
My name is Valentina and I work for Life Gestire 2020, and I follow these monitoring activities as for the bird life and wildlife data in general. Well, experts that have actually worked on these activity, Gestire 2020, were asked to collect data and to convert them in a format that could be then uploaded on the database. For example, this data can be uploaded on Ornito, and then data can be downloaded. And then he uploads data on the database, but data coming from the group research, Vifauna Brescia, Cross Varenna, these associations that belong to the network, territorial network, even Sonke talked about it before, and there was a sort of exchange of engagement without involving money. So they were engaged to provide data elected thanks to their activities, and on the other hand, Lombardy region engaged to use their data in their policies or programs. These associations do work a lot in Lombardy. So with Gestire 2020 and the association, so that's how we worked. There is not an automatic exchange. So I upload on one side and I download on the other side. Okay. Thank you very much for your comment about the Gestire 2020 and regional Lombardy region. So we also have to tackle the Alpine Arch. So you have talked about that some absences are recorded. To me, it's not possible of not observation. What do you mean? Do you really mean that no observation or absence of species? Well, actually, it is better to say no, not observation, because maybe species live there, but the expert has not been able to find it. So yeah, maybe not observation is better. The crayfish, for example. So you've seen some red spots. We thought that some metapopulations were lost because of droughts. In 2023, we have found, in 2023, yes, we found again the crayfish, and we didn't reintroduce them. So they have simply run away from the place they used to live, because in the past it was because of the drought they moved, and then when water came back, the crayfish came back.
Scusate, qui dalla regia mi dicono che bisogna fare un annuncio, cioè che non c'entra niente col monitoraggio, ma c'entra con la cena.
Something about dinner. So those who want to go have dinner and take the bus to go to dinner, well, if those person could confirm or cancel if you have some problems tonight, so you can correct on the paper.
Ok, dunque, salve a tutti.
Hello, everyone. I think I don't know what I'm doing here with you, but well, I was invited, so here I am. I do not work on big projects lasting 8-9 years. I simply work on small projects lasting 1 or 2 years. And I've got actually 2 questions for you. The first one, I've known Sergio for quite a lot of time. And Sergio said that during the monitoring activities, you studied interesting community species and also filling out the database, but I know it pretty well. And what I am asking, what I'm wondering, are you still focused on community species or no? And if it's no, what percentage is it? In the Prealpine Arch and also in the Alpine Arch in Italy, many species that are disappearing in a definitive way are not put in these kind of lists. I can give you some examples, some plants. For example, carrot seed are disappearing and they are not put in this list. So that's my first question. The second one, well, as I was saying, I work on small projects. I work with the University of Milan and with my colleague. We realize projects lasting 1 or 2 years, and then we wonder how long should the monitoring post-operam last in order to make it effective? When we prepared for this session, we prepared ourselves for this session, the first question to me was, in the Alpine Arch, to monitor the biodiversity, should we focus on inhabited species or also focus on different species? If so, which species? And the second part focuses on the monitoring. How long should it last? And how often should it be repeated? So these two questions are pretty interesting. If you want to answer at least one of these two questions, well, if you want, I can express the observatory's point of view. Well, as for the type of species, well, we have started focusing on the species in directive habitat. And when we set up some projects like Gestire 2020 or other, and this project it's a project whose aim is to implement the PAF. But then, of course, its nature has changed because we have immediately understood that it was important to monitor all the species. Well, first of all, because of climate change, because of anthropological pressure. We've got other species that might enter this category because, of course, they are facing important problems. My experience
nei monitoraggi che stanno venendo effettuati in questi ultimi anni sta soffrendo tantissimo. Quindi secondo noi doveva dare un segno di grande, molto stretto. Sta subendo una contrazione fortissima.
An example I could give you is a sort of fish, For example, the Italian spring goby, that because of climate change, its population is reducing more and more.
Essere viste più facilmente dai cittadini che scappano fuori. E questo ci dà un quadro anche di come si muove.
Vabbè. The problem is also that we should be able to know that our bird, for example, does not exist there. It's difficult to recognize it. Yes, of course, we are still linked to the territorial network that is monitored by the Wildlife Observatory. Or, yes, it is still a gap to fill. We receive much data about every species. So let's focus again on species on the Alpine arch. Yes, to me, we should monitor all kind of species because there's an important problem, the climate change. It's important to monitor the invasive species, but it's also true that if we start monitoring something in the Alpine Arch, we should also take into account umbrella species according to some habitats that are altered or threatened. Why? Because if I have to think about not to untap all the efforts that all of us have done in the Alpine Arch, well, it depends on the species that we want to focus on. If you want to create a difficult path. By the way, what I wanted to say that if we have to set up paths that can be difficult, because of course we need to involve many different forces and to coordinate, well, in that case, let's focus on some representative species linked to some specific areas that at the first look, at the first glance, I might be prioritizing. So animals living in old forestries, in peatland. And in that case, I'm not interested anymore in knowing if it belongs to the directive number 413 or 442, sorry. Because what I am interested in is, of course, understanding why they live there and what ecological needs they need to face. Of course, we should monitor everything, and monitoring costs. And even if it is done in a very good way, we really need to focus on specific species. So even if we decide to encompass citizen science, it is still an expensive part of the project, because if we begin, then we cannot stop. We have to teach, form, train, and give a future of it, because people may then get bored of keeping reporting. So if we want to set up something like that, we need to make some choices. This one. Even the lizard Mulaga belongs to the directive number 4.
Chiaro. Andreas?
Che mi sa che l'immagine Lombardia è molto
I think the image is quite complex on the Alpine Arc because this complexity is multiplied for all regions, and each region has its own peculiarities. I love the presentations, especially the one by Angelica, who showed us that there are many approaches in the Alps, and maybe a third of the Alps is already monitored in Switzerland, for example, which is quite a wide region of Alps. There are monitoring of butterflies and lizards and plants, if I recall, not just by looking at species, an umbrella species, but at the whole community. But there are regions where you do a monitoring of butterflies, about butterflies that can be citizen science approaches. At the moment, it's quite difficult to decide or find a way to find a common approach for Alps. However, I think there will always be two complementary approaches of working with umbrella species, such as directives that can be others on the other side, also to work with whole communities, such as birds, farmed birds, or bats that could be a very good group, or are vascular plants of specific areas. However, what's and some can say that at first, at the beginning, is that a monitoring is a monitoring if you do at least one repetition, or at least the first repetition can be the beginning of a monitoring. But by definition, it's not monitoring yet. You need a repetition. Thank you. Is there a question or a comment?
Forse no?
Ok, ma in realtà io volevo dare un commento.
Actually, I'd like to say something on my point of view, which is the point of view of an user. In this context, I am a PhD student of Politecnico, and I'm working with biodiversity on a project of monitoring, specifically in my case related to plants. Now, I deal with geomatic, so different points of view as an observer, and some insights maybe on the best practices to implement at each scale. On one side, I see that there's a lot of attention on metadata for the user, and the user is not an expert. So it's important to try and understand the evolution and distribution of different plants, and it's fundamental to have a good data. So I think that, and I think I speak for everyone involved, not only the presence of information, but also the clarity of this information, because I found myself working with data where there is an observation on the plant and the metadata said 2. So what does 2 mean? 2 hectares, 2 meters? What does it mean? And I'm talking about institutional official data. So this is important, at least in my opinion. The other aspect, the usability of data, the possibility to data that will be reporting details, which are these networks, 10 pentakilometers. It's important to take the coordinates, but another important aspect, and I realize that it's difficult to connect it to the wildlife aspect, it's important to have not only points, but areas, because for many reasons, for many works, it is very important to have figures on specific points. It depends what you work with. And sometimes the information is not that useful. And since there are different monitoring campaigns that are done by experts that map the areas, it is very important for this data to be stored and shared on platforms such as the one of the observatory for the flora. Because in this project where I'm involved, I know that there was a collection of files and these files got lost. The only thing we kept are points. And if I have and relate a satellite image with what I have on the ground, and on the ground I only have 1 point, I cannot do an analysis. So I just wanted to highlight the spatial aspect of the figure, not just the qualitative aspect. Of course, it depends on the reference expertise. Maybe for you, it's important to what's written on it, while for me it's important the space and the spatial characterizations. I just wanted to give you another point of view to this situation. Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to take one of your comments on the availability of data, because you've talked about it with the data we have. I work with an association where we have our database, which is important. It's our little treasure. And I'd like to understand why we should share it with someone. And that's on all the Alpine Arch. If you want to say something about the availability of data and sharing of open data, I think that all of this is very important.
Chiara.
Dai, poi sì.
Grazie, ho trovato anche molto interessante.
Thank you. I thought your insight was very interesting. First of all, because as for metadata, as I was saying, I think we should try and reference to Darwin Core, because in Darwin Core, we have a very important field, which is accuracy, both of coordinates, and the validation of the figure itself. As for spatial data, at least for my experience, in my situation where we have a monitoring from scratch is basically, so we decided how to do everything, look at the data we used to have, but we created the database from nothing. The collection of spatial data is quite difficult because you have much information, and the usability and sharing of figure is quite difficult. So I think that we have a lot to work on it, at least from my experience. As for open data, I understand your view. First of all zoologists have some vision, some of this opinion, I think, also botanic experts as well. What vision, what opinion? The fact that you have the private ownership of a figure, basically. I think since I've worked a lot on historical data in my PhD program, I remapped all the figures from the 70s for Middle East on reacted species, about which we didn't know much of. I think it's very useful to share data, especially when we talk about punctual kind of data. I understand that functional characteristics data of some animals, abundance data, are probably data where the experts can ask for a payback. On distribution data, I don't see this need. And I think that if data are paid by public projects, they should definitely be public. So I think that's my opinion. We can discuss it, but there's no point in talking about making status and conservation assessments at the European or Alpine level if this data is not shared. And that's it. I think that's important. As for Ornito, I speak from the experience with the atlas of mammals, so distribution atlas. And I understand the not sharing of data, but at the end of the day, my opinion is that since it is open, I think the long life and durability will be of an app that will carry out a sharing of data.
Sì, avete
No, volevo aggiungere una cosa riguardo agli open data.
I wanted to add something about open data. I think that from my own experience, there is an evolution in this sense. And I refer to what you were saying. For example, at an academic level, in the last years, I published less articles than I used to, but I always ask you that you make the data set basis of your publications to be public. And I think it's even truer for the research world. My figure is mine, and I want no one else to see it. I don't want them to use this data, but now it's more and more frequent, the obligation to do it, and it's more and more frequent, the obligation to make open data public, and the data that are funded by public institutions. So I think this did a lot to change some people's mind. Eventually, those people who are not obliged by these situations eventually understands that they're going towards a world where these data are more available. And that's true because in the academic level, it's clear that even if it's difficult to collect the data set, it is important to interpret it in a correct way. So if you're good at processing data, if other people share their data, then you have more data to do better assessments and processings. So I think that we're on this way, and we're going to this way.
Per fare una lancia a favore di Sonke, no? Nel senso che io capisco.
So to help Sonke, well, I do understand his question. Donata.it. I think it is fundamental for them. Well, as you say, we've done different agreements with Yodas and Adonata. So for those who collect data in a voluntary way, the idea is to keep them. Sometimes those who do not work at university or belong to some volunteering associations are afraid that data collected thanks to their passion and love for what they do is not used for a scientific way or used in not a very cool way. So I think it can be pretty interesting to frame this aspect. And so even data given freely can be used. And of course, otherwise we will always have people wondering that part. It's also true that when in 2011 we got in contact with Ornito, they told us, we said, well, okay, let's think about it. What they told us was that we might ask our members to insert in the different lines of Ornito to items to give data to the observatory, and then at the end they decided not to take into account the observatory project, so they have not put them in the items. So the aim and the fear is always that maybe data cannot be used for that. I simply would like to add another thing. Another fear is that species in the Habitat Directive are obliged to be monitored, and we know that a lot of regions do not do it, and maybe they ask our data. Well, why? Why should we share our data for an application that has the region? I think it's not right.
If I got really all. I'm not sure if I got really all the content exactly, but I have the impression we are discussing now always about in a kind the data availability. And I think that's one of the crucial points of all our aim for doing also something outside, because we have to make sure that the data is available. And I think we have in different countries good systems. As I'm not sure if it's in Italy the same, but in Switzerland we have all data in one place, and the data is signed. The data is signed as private or not private. And when you have a question, when you need data for a project, you can ask, and you can ask then the privates if they give their data. And I think that's one of the first points. But this could be, in my opinion, a possibility to have a common idea, a common project to learn or to make knowledge exchange from the different countries concerning the availability of data and also the storing of data and the distribution, because I think it's really important when we have so much data and when we want to say something about biodiversity loss on the alpine level. We don't have any chance for the moment, but we have a lot of data, and it doesn't make sense when we send out experts to monitor the biodiversity loss in the alpine states, because we have also data. And therefore we have to try some possibilities to combine it. I don't know if you understand what I mean. And that's one of the aim of this workshop, and also of the message we want to give for tomorrow, that we point out several messages or several points. And I wanted to ask you if it's for you also the same. We have the first point is make data available and work towards systems interoperability at all levels, also from local to international. Also, I think that's one of the first and, in my opinion, the most important point, but yeah.
Scusate, solo un punto.
It's 5:50. I don't know if you need to go.
Quarto d'ora. Sì,
Yeah.
sì, noi dobbiamo chiudere qua, poi possiamo andare via, se ho capito bene, però siamo più o meno alla fine. Ok? Se qualcuno vuole rispondere.
Also, for me, it was only to make a kind of a synthesis of that what I heard. I learned a lot, and I learned also, it's also kind of monitoring. One word in Italy, which is really often used, it's quindi, or something like this. Quindi. It was always quindi. And then I know, also I have to listen.
It depends from the person, because I have my friend on the other session, which is speaking in the other section, in the other session, and he says always diciamo.
Okay, diciamo I know also, but I wanted only to say it's also kind of monitoring some things. And I don't know, I think you want to say something. Please go ahead.
So I generally wonder what will be the role of the alpine regions on the one hand, and the role of the European member states on the other hand, because we have a process of monitoring harmonization and data interoperability harmonization also at the European context, especially on one hand, we had this Europa-bound project. We have Biodiversity Plus, which is doing a lot in this context. And I think it's very important for the Alpine Convention to have it clear what can be the role at the Alpine level and what will be done anyway at the European level. Because, and I see it a bit of
In respect of monitoring.
Of monitoring and also of databases, of course. It's both, yeah. It's intermingled. It's both very important. I think the problem for the Alps is always that we have maybe Switzerland is organized more as a, I don't know.
Sometimes, yeah.
In a national way, also.
Really, only national.
Yeah. Also France is generally very national. Then we have regions like Lombardy, which is totally acting maybe on their own, Also South Tyrol has an own database, an own monitoring scheme, acting more like a state. How can we bring them together, and how can we arrange that we do something meaningful at the Alpine scale?
Exactly. You want to say something, Serena? Because I want to just ask you if you want to say. You can sit here. It's easier to sit as to see. And you can speak also in Italian.
I'm more comfortable speaking in English. I've been working on these issues in English. So for the Alps, we have already acknowledged that there are several different monitoring systems, monitoring schemes, data sets, and it is unrealistic to propose new common indicators that everyone should adopt, because everyone is already very fond and very familiar with the systems they have had in place for quite some time. So in the Alps, we have concluded that what we could do is work on the interoperability of the systems, not even the harmonization of the systems, trying to make them similar, but try to ensure that different systems can still provide information at a scale that is possible, depending on what is included in these databases. And in some cases, this would mean looking at the minimum common denominator, a species of a taxon that is somehow covered by all the monitoring schemes, maybe just one or just two. In other cases, is the maximum common, we don't call it denominator, but it would be looking at indexes or community data that may not be very fine at the Alpine scale yet, because they may be collected at European scale, but that's a common basis. So we work on those indexes, butterfly index, farmland bird index, which will at first give us non-detailed trends, information. But if we decide and state that those indexes are what we have and we can improve them, then we can reach higher detail at the scale where they are collected. For example, if some countries are doing monitoring not very capillary, but in very sparse areas, we could see if they can intensify data collection, but to feed those European indexes or other types of indexes that are already being populated. So just to conclude, either lose significance by looking at the minimum common denominator, maybe one species which is not an umbrella species, but it's already been monitored by everyone, maybe with different systems, but we can see how they can become interoperable, or aiming for higher, more meaningful indicators or indexes that are not very fine, but which we can make fine later on. In principle, I think that we need to look for robustness. So not something that by changing the scale becomes less certain, but that remains significant and can only increase the significancy.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, we are now talking about systems at Alpen-wide, devo parlare in inglese, in italiano. Stavamo parlando.
I'm a little bit tired.
Eh.
Therefore, it's heavy to follow in speak what you want. Okay.
Ormai stiamo parlando di sistemi.
We are talking about some monitoring systems at the Alpine or European zone area. So we need to decide on which scale to integrate. So we need to decide which level and we have to integrate the systems that are already operative. Yeah, I have just one thing to say. It's true that the harmonization processes are done at the European level. And on the Alpine area, we need to find a common line. On the Alpine zone, it would be easier to work because the European level is higher and the Alpine zone where some sharing experience are already existing would be easier. And there is also another aspect. Some species at the geographical point of view are shared, and it would be easier to have a sort of common expertise according about some specific species. And there is also the mountain area. There's the mountain area that, for example, is very peculiar and, sharing some expertise in some biodiverse processes might be in Finland or Norway. Well, these two countries are completely different in terms of alpine monitoring we refer to. Sì, dai.
Thank you, Chiara. It's 6 p.m., so I think that it's time to sum it up.
Ah sì?
Das, was ich vorher gemeint habe, die Dings.
Eccoci.
Das habe ich immer gelassen.
Sì, come sempre, solo discutere.
So, discussing on monitoring in the Alpine Arch requires a lot of time. We talked about whether to talk about this in the time we had or whether to go on monitoring what we told. These are some messages on monitoring that were presented to us before the session. If we just want to quickly look at these points.
Che sono usciti oggi. Che dovrebbe aiutarvi anche domani.
Sì.
Allora. Qua, su questo primo punto abbiamo.
On this first point, we said many things. One of the things which arose is the difficulty to define and apply these systems because they're on different levels, different type of data. There is the approach of using a minimum common denominator, as we said before, or to translate in indexes. But I wouldn't know how to write here. If you have proposals, I'd be grateful.
Posso di cogliere che sì. e passo di cogliere che alla fine, però magari mi sbaglio, che più che stare a riflettere.
I don't think we should just talk about how to detect and define new or different targets, but I think it's better to make an effort and try to put into system the type of monitoring what Serna was saying, which are already there, and try and push towards this possible dialogue between different databases and different types of monitoring. Isn't it right? Yes, but I would put it as evidence of the sharing of this work group.
Benissimo, basta. Questo mi sembrava. Poi mi sbaglio,
I may be wrong, so just tell me what you think. I thought I understood that even bringing different data, different results, the mixed system is a system to promote. A system that is made of expert monitoring and integration of a network of citizen science is something positive to promote, to continue to make a heritage for everyone, because it brings us as much as we can from the presence absence data on the territory that can help us identify. And the other thing is that the absence of data, which is not absence of data, but is searched but not found, should also be on common base. Like saying when we do monitoring,
Sì, ma noi tu c'è scrivere dobbiamo dirci gli scritti, possiamo.
Sì, sì, anche io ho scritto
era quello del cercato non trovato, era la terza.
the third thing about search but not found. I don't know if you share my opinion.
Io più che altro.
Infatti.
Io magari, se posso, segnerei anche il perché.
I'd like to also mark why mixed systems should be promoted, and that's because it's complementary methods. I would add it.
E hanno anche.
And if we do it, if it is done together, there is a great effectiveness, I think. I would add metadata. The importance of metadata, integrating copyright, as Angelica was saying earlier.
giusto?
I think that another point for summarizing a little bit what we said, also to establish some guidelines on data collection and data sharing. So that, as we said before, actually, so that we can also enhance the readability of the data itself. So that we have a better data from the source, and then this data can be better used from this. So actually, maybe the good practices. Practice or guidelines.
Linee guida e buone pratiche.
So guidelines are good practice for the collection and sharing of data.
Ok,
No, sì, e l'altra cosa che era veramente
And the other thing was the thing about the community data, the importance of community data. I don't know if it's a point or maybe a challenge. We know that they're important, so the challenge is how to implement this data. Of course, at a Alpine or European level.
Sì, forse anche lì avremo un sistema mix.
We would have a mixed system, data and data of umbrella species and directive species.
Diventa complesso. Ok.
Sì,
Forse per quello una cosa che è importante.
Maybe an important thing for me is that obviously it's important to have all interoperable operating data, but I think monitoring in schemes, I think that we don't have many of them in Europe or in Alps. That means that it wouldn't be enough to put together what we have, but for the future, I think that we will need new monitoring schemes at European or Alpine level or whatever that is.
I would like to add that since we are starting to think in terms of alpine scale, perhaps a priority would be to begin an interoperable monitoring, starting from the obligations we will soon have under the EU Nature Restoration Law, which compels us to use the European indexes, and also begin extracting data to see if we are achieving the targets, the biodiversity targets set by the European Biodiversity Strategy, the Global Biodiversity Framework. Let's start from those things that are already acknowledged priorities.
I think that the requests that are made for monitoring are big, and the ground data collection is small. Often the people ask a lot of the data without spending much on the data acquisition.
Yeah.
But also the law is also focusing on lowlands in areas that are outside protected areas. And you don't have much data on that.
Yes, that's right. I think that's one of the also the challenge. We have a lot of challenges.
Yes.
It's not so important.
Okay, I don't know if these things should be in here in the list.
I think
When I hear, I think we have a lot is in our interoperability inside, because you can also combine different levels in this other. You don't have to.
Interoperable.
It's inside. It's
Yeah.
Ebba said what I wanted to say.
so it's trying to rephrase it.
Exactly. I think we want to rephrase it this evening, if it's possible for you, Serena. And then it will present it tomorrow morning. And if you have some other ideas, you can always write to us. I think that would be good, because I have the impression when someone of you have to go before dinner, we don't want to make it now too long. Also for me, it's no problem, but I don't want to use too much of your time.
One thing that already came out was that for me, it doesn't seem to be clear what to monitor. When we had the introductory presentations on the Alps, the data was presented. We have 30,000 species of animals. And before, when we talked about what to monitor, we said species of the Habitats Directive, indicator species, umbrella species, representative species. These are all different terms. They mean different things and they are different species. I don't think there's a very clear vision on what's the best to monitor.
That was my thought, as I said before. I think we have to work exactly on this topics, because we have a lot of data, but we don't know exactly what we can use for the alpine scale. You want to say?
Yeah.
So in my opinion, let the existing data set tell us what we should monitor. It depends on what is contained in the existing data set and what we can extract from them. It's not about now thinking of what we need to monitor. Let's see what's in there and what can be a common species, taxon, community we can use. And also, let's be guided by what our obligations are. And then see how member states can work together with Switzerland, depending on the data that Switzerland has and doesn't have to use to comply with the European directive. So for me, it goes without saying that it's habitat directive species, the indexes that are written down in the EU Nature Restoration Law. And then we see what's in the data sets.
Yeah, I think it's good, but I think we have also to be open. It's possible that we have to focus on something we don't know yet, and it's also possible that we have to investigate in a kind of new monitoring, as you said before. Also not new, but